This is The Strange Recital, a podcast about fiction which questions the nature of reality. Last night I took the riverside walk for the first time in longer than I care to remember. Nothing much had changed. Homeless men and women were still spending the night on municipal benches. Some were asleep. They breathed noisily or moaned. They looked like bundles of rags, although one or two of them had contrived to wrap flattened cardboard boxes around themselves. Others were awake and clutched their most valuable possessions close to them. A bottle of cheap wine or methylated spirits, in which they perhaps found escape or comfort or oblivion. They were all sickly, sicklier than they even knew. That's what came of inhaling the cold, damp air and autumn mist that visited them from the sluggish water. One by one they would die here, or somewhere else. It didn't really matter. That's the way it had always been. As I passed these lost and abandoned people, I moved slowly, for I had no reason to hurry, on this or any other night. I would not be in this place for long. There were other places I would visit later, places that really suited me so much better. I watched as a man just ahead of me struggled to his feet. He almost fell as he stood, then he slumped down, in a sitting position, onto his bench again. "Shadow," he said. His voice not quite a whisper, as I drew abreast of him. That's what they always called me. I don't know where the name came from, or what these unfortunates saw to make them believe I was a shadow. I paused and looked at the man. No light reflected from his eyes. Everything about him spoke of darkness. He said nothing more. He'd forgotten me, and was removing the screw-on cap from his bottle. When I walked away, I heard that single word again, shadow, as indistinct as a distant voice carried by a breeze. I turned and looked back to the man on the bench. He was now swigging from his bottle. Seeing how absorbed he was in the only thing that gave his life meaning, I realized that he may not have spoken at all. 5 meters above my head, the streetlights on the parapet were all wrapped in glaucotomous halos caused by the thin river mist. My silhouette was no longer visible by their light as it slid silently across the stone slabs beneath my feet. Only the creaking sounds of pleasure cruisers moored until the tourist season came again, and the gentle lapping of the river found their way to my ears. At this time of the morning, near silence was always the most common sound in this part of the city. Farther away, fish and vegetable markets would be alive with activity as they prepared for the wholesale transactions that fed the street markets in every quarter. Here, though, the city still slept. That's why I liked it. This was my time. I had left my atelier an hour earlier and had allowed my feet to bring me here, as they threaded their way through the maze of forgotten alleys and snickets that are hidden by the modern stores and offices and apartment buildings that everyone knows. Along the way, I'd passed the memories of people I knew well. There was the old lamplighter who knew nothing of electricity. The wonder of his time was gas. His shadow was still where he'd left it, visible only to those who knew where to look. Georgina, for such as she called herself, although her real name, I'd heard, was Mavis Bloodworthy, still offered to perform any kind of sex act with anybody for a few pennies, enough to keep her in gin for an hour. "Quick fuck, love," I heard her say. My hand was feeling for coins in my pocket. Before I remembered, she too was gone. Then I came upon little Robert. His story was so sad it pained me as I recalled it. But still he smiled, and still he politely lifted his cap as I quickly passed him. Then there was Gilbert Barnfeather. I had never encountered him, but, like everyone of his time, I knew of him. He was reviled as a killer of dogs before he turned to killing people, and of those he had slaughtered 14, men, women and children. He had no preference. It was said that he simply enjoyed watching the life drain out of one of his fellows before he was caught by officers of the law. I didn't attend his public hanging, believing it to be too bloodthirsty an event for my delicate disposition. Afterwards, it was said that he hadn't died quickly and that he was left hanging for days, his struggle for life slowly ending. Several months later, when I decided I could once again pass through the tiny square at the confluence of streets and alleyways where the gibbet had been erected, all that remained was the shadow of a man jerking and twisting on a wall. People were going about their business as usual. Children were playing. Dogs were barking. I accosted a person I knew vaguely. He was a trader in tobacco, and I had, on occasion, purchased from him. I asked him about the shadow. "Does it not make you shiver every time you pass it by?" "No, sir, it does not," he replied. "That foul person received the punishment he deserved, and his shadow will forever be there as a warning to other miscreants." As he went on his way, I thought how abrupt his manner had been. Barnfeather's shadow still dances on that wall when the sun shines brightly, and seeing it still chills me to the marrow. That's one of the reasons I seldom walk by day, even though those alleys are often gloomy places. Most shadows that remain, especially when they are the shadows of those who lived without harming others, are visible by the light of street lamps as well as sunshine. But Barnfeather's shadow, thankfully, needs the strongest of sunlight to give it life. By and by, I came upon the Hall of Clocks. This was not exactly a place of business, nor was it exactly a service for the benefit of the public. I think I can best describe it as an obsession that in some measure provides the gentleman, for indeed he is a gentleman, who is always in attendance with an income of sorts. He is a man small of stature and thin of limb. His fingers are like the legs of a spider, and appear to be capable of acts of dexterity of which the fingers of a person such as myself are incapable. Residents of this ancient quarter bring him their clocks whenever they need his attention. "Time has stopped," I heard an old woman say to him one very rainy evening, as she deposited a medium-sized clock that appeared to me to be of German origin in front of him. "Oh no," the man said. "You see, madam, time never stops. Time, as measured by your beautiful clock, is simply taking a rest. It needs to be reawakened." He then proceeded to open the hinged door on the back of the clock and allowed his spindly fingers to crawl inside. I heard a pinging sound, followed by a metallic twang. "There," he said, with an air of mild satisfaction as he closed the door. Turning the clock to face him, he opened the glass front and then fumbled with a large bunch of keys that were hanging from his belt. Finding the one he sought, he used it to carefully wind the clock's mechanism. 1 turn, 2 turns, 3 turns, and then set the hands to the correct time. By now, the clock was healthily ticking. "With careful use, your clock will last forever," he said to the woman. She smiled at him, dropped 2 or 3 pennies into his hand, picked up her clock and left. "What did you do to that clock, sir? How did you awaken the time within it?" I asked, as my curiosity caused me to be imprudently curious. "My fingers know," he said. "I permit them to enter a clock, and they know what they must do. Can I be of assistance to you?" "I have but come to admire your wonderful clocks." I spread my arms expansively to include the hundreds of clocks arrayed around us. Such workmanship they display. "But tell me, sir, why are they all silent?" "The times are resting," he replied, "all but for this one." He rested his hand on an elegant carriage clock. "This one shows the time for today. Tomorrow, another will show the correct time. That's how it must be." I smiled at him. "I have all of time here, last year and next year, and all the years that flow to and from them." I felt some uncertainty as to what he meant, but I offered him no more questions. Instead, I pulled a few small-value coins from my pocket and, as the old woman had done, I dropped them into the palm of his hand. "Thank you," he said as I turned to leave. "Please return whenever you feel the need." Many times I've returned to visit him. He appears never to change. For myself, I find it most reassuring to know that time is in such good and capable hands. I must beg your forgiveness, or at the very least your indulgence, for during my rambling discourse, which I'd intended should take place only within my mind, I've become aware that others may be listening. If you are from that part of the city which we call the world of haste, it is possible, indeed it is likely, that you are unaware not only of some of those things I've touched upon, such as the shadows that remain, but also of the very existence of our ancient places at the heart of what you consider to be your city. If this should be the case, if you continue to listen, you will, I hope, gain some understanding of the fact that our two societies have coexisted for many, many years. We frequently pass between our places and yours. You may have noticed us from time to time. You may have dismissed us as odd, but you seldom find your way to those places where we might congregate, such as the inns or the chapagog. Indeed, perhaps I should speak of the chapagog, since it will be quite unfamiliar to you if you are of the world of haste. There was a time when our city was one. By your way of measuring time, that was several centuries ago. To us, it was as yesterday. For reasons we choose not to remember, many people came to despise our Jewish citizens, and those times being less tolerant than today, a pogrom came about. Those of our Jewish brethren who were not killed fled to other places. Only the rabbi remained. But so frightened was he of being killed that he forsook his faith and was baptized a Christian. He converted his synagogue into a church, and thereafter referred to it as the Church of the Cleansing. I knew this man, not as a close associate, but sufficiently well to be polite to him whenever we encountered each other. From the day of his conversion, it was rumored that his new faith was not founded in biblical principles. In fact, he had become a convenient combination of Christian and Jew. Years later, when Jewish traders began to return to our city, he began to refer to his building as his chapagog, for it served the needs of both faiths, who soon found that they could worship together in harmony. That situation abides to this day. With the hall of clocks and the chapagog well behind me, I emerged from our city and entered the world of haste on a wide boulevard that followed the course of the river. Even at this hour of the morning, when the pavements were empty of people and the road without its daytime throng of horseless carriages, bright streetlights were still shining. I must say here that I so much prefer the more human glow of our gas lamps and tallow candles, because they do not create a sense of daylight when the world should be in darkness. I made my way across the road, and thus it was I came to the steps that took me down to the riverside walk, where I passed slowly by the many resting indigent and inebriates, and heard someone, I really know not whom, how could I possibly know, call me Shadow in a whispered voice as I passed him by. I did not look at the man. Of that I had no need, for I knew that like all those here, those who lived with the clinking of bottles, those who slept when they slept, to the lapping of the river's waters against worn stone, that he was a discarded soul, well beyond any help I might offer. When I was a step or two beyond him, I heard a deep sigh that rattled with the sound of life trying to escape a dying body. I had often heard it whispered among these sad people that the touch of my shadow, my very passing, pulled life away from those willing to give it leave to depart from them. How could that be, especially here, where on a night such as this, shadows, including my own shadow, were no more than gestures to the darkness? Shadow was not my name, of course, but it is what many of the unfortunates here have called me these several centuries past. Perhaps it is that any brethren from our city who choose to visit here are also called Shadow. In my city, our city, I have a name, but never will it be known to the world of haste, as such passing of knowledge is forbidden to us. I walked slowly along the riverside, catching the aroma of stagnant water as it rose up and dropped away again, sensing the life and death with which it was redolent. In the world of haste, the river was cleaner than it had been through all the years I had known it. But it was not really clean, and I could well imagine the cargo of misery that travelled amongst its ripples until it dropped to the river's bed and became the silt of life. By and by, as I walked, the river entered a large garden whose trees and shrubs came almost to the water's edge. How do I know this? Because long ago, perhaps as much as a century before this time, I often visited this city when the sun was upon the sky. I walked here by the light of day. I saw the seasons in this garden, from the glorious colours of summertime to the dull greys and browns of winter. That was before the time of horseless carriages and shining birds that soared noisily across the sky. It was, in fact, before this world of haste had come to pass. In that time, as I walked here, people would look at me with some curiosity. They would shake their heads, as if they were unsure as to whether they had seen me or not. Then they would look right through me and go on their way, sometimes glancing back at me, sometimes not. I often wondered what thoughts had passed through their minds, whether they wanted to reach out and touch me to discover whether or not I was real. Nowadays, the world of haste, during the hours of daylight, is no place for anyone from our city. When I became aware that light was touching the eastern rim of the sky, that the first moments of dawn were glinting from polished glass windows, I knew I had to leave the world of haste. I had walked right through the garden and had emerged close to the arches of a bridge across the river. I could remember the time before that bridge had been built, when this crossing had provided a living for a ferryman and his family. Now the bridge arched slightly towards the tall buildings across the river, and though quiet now, it would soon teem with the people of this city and their omnibuses and horseless carriages. 6 hours, I estimated, I'd been in this city, as I crossed the boulevard towards where I must go. That was time enough, and I would not feel the need to return here for many a long night. As I approached the side street that would lead me back by twists and turns to the timeless streets and alleyways of our city, a young man approached me. "You been to a fancy dress?" he asked. "A fancy dress?" I asked him, unsure of what he meant, but I knew he would not hear me. He reached out a hand to touch me. I felt it enter me, disrupt me. Then the man stumbled and fell to the ground, thrown off his balance by my incorporeality. "What the?" I heard him call out, but by then I was around the corner of the street and approaching the snicket that only people from our city knew was there. By the time I was threading my way through the maze of streets that led to my home, I could already hear the sounds of the world of haste rising above the near silence in which I was. As I neared my street, I passed the apothecary's shop, I passed the bootmakers, I passed the butcher's from where my nose detected the metallic tang of fresh blood. I came to the printery, where unfolded sheets of the city journal were pegged on lines of thin string while their ink dried. "A morning paper?" the printer asked from the doorway. "Alas, I have no coinage with me," I replied. "That's quite all right, sir. You may make good your small debt to me on the next occasion that you pass this way." With those kind words, he removed a copy of his publication from a small pile of dried and folded copies and handed it to me. "Thank you most kindly, Mr. Lafarge," I said. Then I smiled and went on my way. Freshly baked bread has, for me, always had a most enticing aroma, so a little nearer my atelier, I paused outside Mrs. Mellow's bakery shop and looked longingly at the stack of freshly baked loaves in its window. Seeing me, Mrs. Mellow, who made the most delicious bread and who looked dumpling-like, just as a baker should, bustled out to greet me. "All fresh this very morning," she said. "I've been working since 3 o'clock so you can enjoy your breakfast." "Alas, I have no coinage with me," I said to her. "That's quite all right. You may make good your debt to me on the next occasion that you pass this way to buy my bread." With those kind words, she took a loaf, wrapped it in muslin, and handed it to me. "Thank you most kindly, Mrs. Mellow," I said. Then I smiled and went on my way. By the time I reached the door to my atelier, I had already broken several morsels from Mrs. Mellow's warm loaf to satisfy a hunger that I didn't know was there. As I removed my key from a pocket, I heard a familiar voice. "Milk, sir? Fresh milk?" Mr. Bray asked. "Yes, indeed, Mr. Bray," I replied. "I shall fetch a ewer that you may fill it for me." I returned a moment later and watched as Mr. Bray measured out my milk. "I would like a good pat of butter too, if you please, to go with Mrs. Mellow's fresh bread." "And very fine bread it is, very fine bread. That will be 1 groat, sir." Having collected coins in my atelier, I made good my debt to Mr. Bray. "What a beautiful day it's going to be, do you not think, Mr. Bray?" He shrugged his shoulders. We both looked up at the sky, heard the distant noise of a metallic bird passing overhead. "I do believe you're right. Good days in our city are always good days." "Thank you, Mr. Bray, thank you," I said as I smiled, shook his hand, and went inside to breakfast.
That was Shadow, written by James Goddard and read by Tom Newton. It was previously published in the collection Dolls from Leaky Boot Press, 2019. Hello, James. Welcome.
Hello, Brent. Tom, it's a pleasure to be here. You'll have to excuse my voice. I'm sort of down with a chest infection at the moment, so I'm a bit wheezy.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that, and I hope you get better soon, and thanks for muscling through. Now, this is your second time on The Strange Recital. Back in 2020, we featured your story called The Knowledge. It shares some attributes with Shadow. Both are very spookily atmospheric about old London. Is that a favourite setting of yours?
When I lived in the south of England, I used to visit London, virtually every weekend. And it was always a pleasure for me to wander around the narrow Victorian streets that were lost and hidden away among the modern buildings. Those streets are filled with atmosphere, sometimes with menace, and sometimes with things you simply don't expect. So yes, it is a favourite locale.
I like the gradual way that we begin to understand that the narrator is other-dimensional, a ghost, perhaps. Did it just evolve that way in the writing, or did you plan that slow reveal?
The slow reveal as to the true nature of my narrator is totally deliberate. If I'd made it clear from the start that he was something other, in inverted commas, the story would have unfolded in quite a different way. In the world of haste, which is obviously our world, he's invisible to most, but he can be seen by some. To others, he's just a shadow. He's definitely not a ghost, but more of a kind of ethereal presence. In his world, which is the real world to him, he's as solid as you or I.
Mm-hmm.
The language of the story has a slightly archaic or even gothic feel. Do you use this style in other stories, or is it just pertinent to this one?
My choice of words is purely a matter of style, really.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to give the impression that my narrator is a man from another age. I see my narrator's world as a kind of late 18th or early 19th century idealised version of London. So I tried to create something of the feel of a story written at that time but without going over the top. Hence the formal and slightly stilted language, which you, of course, rightly identify as Gothic. I've never used this kind of archaic language or attempted archaic language in other stories, although it does appeal to me.
What's a snicket?
I love the word snicket.
Yeah.
The word itself is a Northern English dialect word, meaning an alleyway. I shouldn't really use it in a London setting, but I think it fits in well with the story. It's this alleyway that allows my narrator to access the world of haste. People from his world know about the alleyway. Some of them can even go through it, of which he is one, but not all of them. But the people in the world of haste are unaware of it at all.
I'm intrigued with the way you conjure up what might be called multiple geographies, different worlds or locations mapped over each other, occupying the same temporal and physical space. It's an idea that resonates with me. Or perhaps it could be described as imbuing memories with consciousness. Do you have any thoughts on that?
My narrator's world does occupy the same physical space as a part of central London, but it's a kind of forgotten area, a bit like Soho, really, when you wander through those narrow streets. I know that's an impossibility, but what's fiction worth if it doesn't address the impossible and the implausible? This forgotten world also occupies the same temporal space, in a way, but in it, time is regulated differently. A second is longer than a second, a minute is longer than a minute. I'll leave you to figure out how that could work. But for the sake of my story, it must, and it does, because I make sure it does. This forgotten world is aware of the world of haste, obviously, because my narrator goes there occasionally. But most people in the forgotten world want nothing to do with it.
The world of haste. It's a great way to set apart our times from earlier eras. I relate quite strongly to the narrator's desire to stay out of the world of haste. Maybe that's why I live in the woods. Do you share that impulse?
Do I have a desire to escape from the world of haste? The short answer is yes. I'd love to live in some isolation, in the woods or on a hilltop or overlooking a river, but I simply can't afford to. If I could afford to, I'd still like to keep the advantages of some of the more beneficial technology, but a lot of the shit could go.
Yep.
I think it's part of the human condition, at least in the West, that we yearn for a simpler life.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you've managed to achieve some of that.
Both Shadow and The Knowledge are included in your collection Dolls, which came out in 2019. Tell us a little about that book.
I don't really have a lot to say about my book Dolls, apart from the fact that I'm overall fairly pleased with it. I wrote the stories over a 2 or 3 year period, and most of them have a supernatural element of some kind. I'm not a believer in gods or ghosts or ghoulies, but the ideas behind them have fascinated me most of my life. Why people dream up strange things is, I suppose, a kind of testament to both the human imagination and the human sense of need. Of the stories in the book, my favourites are probably Shadow, another one called The Violinist, which I know you've seen,
Yeah.
and the final story called Elements, which is a four-header.
I gather you have quite a significant collection of science fiction novels from the past, which you share on your Instagram page called, forgive me if I mispronounce it, Opusculium? Tell us about that.
I like the word opusculium, but don't worry about pronouncing it. It's a made-up word, and it has no meaning whatsoever.
Oh.
To me, it sounds a bit like a kind of lost organ in the human body. You rush to the doctor and say, Doctor, I've got a problem with my opusculium.
Oops.
As for my book collection, yeah, it's quite large. It's about 10,000 volumes, mostly first editions, many of them signed. It's a lifelong collection, really. I'm interested mostly in science fiction stories and novels about the soft sciences or centred on the soft sciences. I'm not much interested in stories about spaceships and galactic wars and things like that. The upshot of that is it's a collection of books more heavily biased towards the literary end of science fiction, what I call the good authors. I know that's very subjective, but I don't count Asimov, Heinlein, Clarke as good authors. Basically, they're dinosaurs. I also collect photographic monographs and books of art and illustration, as well as modern first editions by quite a few literary writers. If I sold my collection, I could probably just about afford that cabin in the woods.
Yeah.
Now, you've been a small literary publisher longer than we have. Is Leaky Boot Press still active?
Leaky Boot Press is on hold at the moment, unfortunately, mainly due to health problems of my own. I hope I'll get back to it one day. No idea when. Before Leaky Boot Press, I was involved with a small press called Kerosene Publications. We published limited editions of science fiction, short story collections and novels, mostly by well-known writers.
I understand you're also a photographer. Tell us about your work and where our listeners can see it.
Photography has been a lifelong hobby for me, and I love black and white images. I think black and white, or more properly monochrome photography, is more important than colour photography. Colour is everyday, it's banal, whereas black and white almost forces us to look at the world in a different way.
Okay.
I try to post one image a day on Facebook, but I've also got 2 Instagram pages for my photographs. Rather than spell out some addresses here, maybe you could include some clickable links.
Well, thanks again for joining us, James.
It's been a pleasure to answer your intelligent questions.
Well, thank you, James, for answering them. And we'll put your photography links up on our website. But before we go, are you the shadow?
Who, me? This is The Strange Recital, on the web at thestrangerecital.com. The incidental music underneath the story was by Balance Engineer. The second piece was Glove by XJ5000 from the album Round Thing. This is episode 24121.